when the pace of growth for HDFC has slowed in the last 2 years in line with the overall trend in the sector, it has still managed to outpace industry. Okay, so it's just a question and we just have to figure it out. So let's figure it out. So basically they're saying, obviously it's referring to HDFC as the subject of the focus here. And in the last 2 years, what's happened is the growth pace has slowed down, right? And this is also what's happening in the market. The current trend or the overall trend in the sector is that. But, so there's some sort of a contrast here in the context, right? But still managed to outpace industry. So even though there was slow growth, and that's what is also the overall trend, HDFC managed to outpace the industry. So when there is some sort of a contrasting element in the context, right? When is not an appropriate word that brings in contrast, right? What can I replace when with? Even though, although, right? Or while. Any of these words can be replaced. So obviously the error is in part 1. Right? So you're saying, just understand the context first. Once you understand the context, it becomes easier for you to identify where the error is. So the context is saying, hey, growth pace was slow, but HDFC still managed to, so these are your clue words, still managed to outpace industry. So contrast in the context, right? So the more appropriate word then when would be while, although. So although the pace of growth for HDFC has slowed in the last 2 years, or while the pace of growth for HDFC has slowed. So while this was happening, it still managed to outpace industry, right? So here, if I look at while in the context, it brings me the meaning of although, or in spite of the fact that the pace of growth for HDFC has slowed in the last 2 years in line with the overall trend in the sector, HDFC has still managed to outpace industry. I'm not following you, Akil. Ma'am, why for HDFC and slowdown is not error? Part 4 is what? Still managed to outpace industry. Still managed to outpace the industry. Yeah, the would make it a little more accurate, right? While the pace of growth for HDFC has slowed in the last 2 years in line with the overall trend in the sector, it has still managed to outpace the industry. Yes. I would go with the before industry. It makes it even more accurate. I would say while the growth phase for HDFC has been slow in the last 2 years, right? I would replace, if that is the case, we can kind of look at every other segment and pinpoint and say there is an error, but it still sounds a little awkward. While the pace of growth for HDFC, it's a very long sentence, this part A itself. I would replace the entire thing saying while, the growth pace for HDFC has been slow, or like most of you have said, while the pace of growth for HDFC has slowed down in the last 2 years in line with the overall trend in the sector. So either ways, the error is in part 1, right? While the growth pace of HDFC, yeah, again, off sounds absolutely fine. Instead of for as a preposition brings in the meaning of purpose. So while the growth pace of HDFC has slowed down or has been slow, off is more appropriate because we're referring to HDFC's growth pace. And I would say again, the last part also, part 4, the before industry seems more appropriate. Yeah. The officer as well as the clerks absented themselves from the office. Okay. So when you have these sentences, which says as well as, right? So most of you are coming back and saying part 3. Let me just put the parts. So the officer is part 1 as well as the clerks is part 2. Absented themselves is part 3. From the office is part 4. So to remove the before clerks, absconded will be appropriate. Absented means they were not there, right? So what's so incorrect about that word? Why do you want to put another vocabulary? So a lot of you are coming back and giving different answers. But let's look at the context quickly, right? The officer is a primary subject, right? Which is a singular subject, right? So when you have as well as and other subjects, you still have to give priority to the primary subject, right? Only when you have and, then you can look at both the subjects and take it as a plural subject. So here, the officer as well as the clerks absented Arpita and probably a couple of others also. So this is more to do with a pronoun related error, but it's very easy for us to get confused simply for the fact that we count as well as in terms of and. and we look at themselves is fine because it's referring to the clerks as well as the officer. So we can't go like that, right? So the officer as well as the clerks absented himself would be more appropriate from the office. Yeah, so all you need to do is, error is in part 3. You kind of replace themselves with himself. That's it. For example, when it comes to subject-verb agreement, when there are two subjects connected by and, you take it as plural subjects, right? And then accordingly you choose the verb and the pronoun and everything. But here when you have, especially in for questions like finding error, it's important for you to identify the primary subject so you don't get confused. So this is a pronoun related error where you'll have to change themselves to himself because we are paying attention to the primary subject, which is the officer, who is a singular subject, as well as it's just additional information. That's how we need to look at it, especially for subject verb agreement errors and when it's in combination with a pronoun error. In fact, maybe we can look at a couple of questions on these lines. Maybe I'll include that in the daily test, right? Especially for pronoun related errors. Maybe we can look at that. It can also be used for a group. It depends on just the context. What are you referring to specifically? That's about it. Or grammatically, it doesn't make sense to say the officer as well as the clerks absented him from the office. It sounds illogical, no? The source might give whatever response, but remember, himself is a reflexive pronoun, right? So the action is happening upon oneself. So here, the officer is absenting himself, right? How can it be the officer absented him from the office? That's not making sense to me, right? So I want you to just apply the concept. So would you say, if I'm taking the primary subject alone, the officer absented him from the office, or the officer absented himself from the office? Which sounds correct? Action done upon oneself, right? In that context, I thought himself would be more appropriate. I'm moving on to the second question. There is none who can support you in this crucial period. So whenever you have, another thing is, you have sentences beginning with there is none. The usual construction is there is none. What's the usual construction? Anybody? We've kind of looked at this earlier also. Not no one. Okay. Let me repeat the question again. There is none. If a sentence begins like that, what is the construction that follows? In fact, we've covered this in our daily test also. None but. Okay. The construction is, haven't seen that usage. Okay. There is none that. Let me just give you some example sentences. There is none that is righteous. Righteous means good. In fact, this is a very archaic form of expression, right? It's formal. You'll probably find such sentences in the Bible, right? There is none that is righteous. There is none that seeketh after God, right? Nobody talks like this nowadays. So it's archaic, it's formal. Conversationally, most of you have come back and said, there is no one who can support you in this crucial period. But in terms of, for our finding error purposes, right, the expression is there is none, not who, that. So the error is in part 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this might also change. See, the problem with finding error questions is some of them are very archaic, but they are formally written, right? In formal writing, we use such when we are making references. We are referring to certain things, right? So there is none that supports you. There is none that is righteous. There is none that seeketh after God. There is none that doeth good. All these references that I'm giving, if you look at the language, nobody speaks like this. But it's the right form of expression or construction, right? So my hope is, who and that, both are used for people, right? We know that in terms of relative pronouns, but I'm saying in terms of construction, hopefully, I would honestly not support these statements because nobody speaks like this conversationally nowadays. And like most of you came back and said, it's easier to say the error is in part 1. There is no one who can support you in this crucial period, right? If you separate none and put it as no one, then it sounds right conversationally. But in terms of our finding error context, this is the right expression or construction. There is none that, and then whatever. Yeah.